Welcome to episode 115 of the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm Aaron Breitman, coming to you on Wednesday, July 19th. Wanted to focus on this episode in regard to the recent NCAA rule change with coaching limitations, and it varies across multiple sports. You might have seen basically Rutgers has made some coaching additions to multiple programs. There's been a couple announced this week, and I thought this would be a good chance to kind of address it. It was a rule change voted on in January or proposed in January that went into effect on July 1st. So there's basically three different changes that have been made. First off, basketball, both men's and women's. There's now allowed to be two additional assistant coaches uh, for both men's and women's basketball. So this means from three assistant coaches to five. Now the difference or the continued limitation is that you can only have three recruiting assistant coaches, meaning only three assistants can go out on the road, can recruit. The other two can be have on court responsibilities, obviously help with player development. So that's huge, right? And overall, I would say just the fact that more coaches being added and allowed across multiple sports is just good for student athletes, it's good for programs, it's good for universities. Now, of course, the caveat to that is that budgets are going to go up. So just because the rules have been, the limitations have been lifted, doesn't mean that every program at every school is going to take advantage of that opportunity. But at Rutgers, we're seeing a flurry of activity. So, men's basketball, it's not really new news. It was announced not too long ago, but longtime Rutgers staffer Steve Hain, who was chief of staff for Peichel, and then was an assistant coach for 2 years before TJ Thompson, then went back to kind of that special advisor role, chief of staff role. He's going to be one of those two additional assistant coaches in the sense of his ability to participate in practice beyond the court, work with players. And then also Mike Larkin, who's been with the program a long time now, director of basketball operations. So what I've found with basketball is that they're keeping dual titles, right? So they're going to have these administrative roles. They're also going to be assistant coaches because they don't have the recruiting responsibilities. Mike Larkin's director of basketball operations. He's also going to be now that fifth assistant in terms of being able to be on the court next season. Now, women's basketball. First off, wanted to address, obviously the awful loss of Nikki McCray Penson, uh, college basketball legend, WNBA legend, NBA, basketball Hall of Famer. I did get a comment recently on a review that it was a terrible omission that I haven't spoken about her yet. I did want to point out, just in terms of this podcast with the Scarlet Faithful site, I cover a lot of ground, and I had a pretty in-depth article with tributes around basketball, honoring Coach McCray Princeton. But I hadn't previously talked about it on the podcast. That's true. But I just wanted to clarify that I did actually cover it, and I'm planning to cover it throughout. I have a someone from the program going to be on the podcast soon, so going to talk about it there. But also, just in terms of these coaching changes, I wanted to point out that Rutgers women's basketball hired two assistant coaches this week, which I'm going to go over, and last week. Neither have anything to do with the unfortunate loss of Nikki McCray Penson. These are part of those two additional spots. So, Rutgers women's basketball obviously was holding out on hope for the return of Nikki McCray Penson. Obviously, unfortunately, her health did not succeed. So, terrible loss for the program. Terrible for the loss for the college basketball. And may she rest in peace. In terms of the additions that women's basketball made, they've hired two new assistant coaches. Today it was announced, or actually yesterday, excuse me, Neka and Kampale played at, or she most recently coached at USC, which is a pretty good program. And before that was at UNLV, and was also at UC Santa Barbara. Had a very, very good basketball career at Texas not too long ago, about a decade ago. So she's a younger assistant coach. She's going to come on board as, like I said, one of those two new assistant roles and also serve a dual role as director of recruiting. So big hire there. And then also Coach Reese Washington hired a former assistant of hers from Penn State who has a ton of coaching experience, Janine Wasilewski. That was announced last week. She most recently was the head coach at Southwestern Michigan College. She was an assistant at St. Francis. She was at Penn State as an assistant for 3 years. She was at Loyola of Chicago, which is in Missouri Valley. She was also a very successful Big Ten player at Northwestern. She was part of a Big Ten championship team. Went to 2 NCAA tournaments there. So two really good hires, two different hires in terms of experience, both really good playing careers at big time schools, but also in terms of the recruiting background. And I should clarify that Coach Wasilewski is also going to serve in a dual role as Director of Player Enhancement. So again, these are two roles that are not replacing Nikki McCray Penson, so they're not going to be a recruiting role. They're going to serve dual roles, and then you can expect Rutgers to look to add in terms of a new assistant coach that will be part of recruiting. So that's basketball. So again, just to clarify, both men's and women's basketball can add two assistant coaches. They can't recruit. They can have other roles. And Rutgers men's and women's basketball both took advantage of that rule change and the limitation no longer being there. So that's a great thing. Now the other two changes that happened, one that is kind of minor in how I interpret it is football. So grad assistants have been reclassified or recharacterized in terms of how they're cited. They're now graduate coaches, and there's a limitation on only being able to do it for 3 years. So kind of a minor change there, not added positions. And then the one that's pretty big, especially for being that it's for Olympic sports, is that the volunteer coach now has been transitioned to you can add an assistant coach. So that's a really big change. Women's lacrosse announced today that TT Naslonsky, the all-time points leader in program history, was elevated from volunteer coach to assistant coach. She worked with the goalkeepers last year, Sophia Cardella, very good goalkeeper for Rutgers. And so that's a big win for head coach Melissa Lehman to obviously get program legend on staff full time as an assistant coach. It's great for TT Naslonsky that she can be a full time assistant coach now. And for Olympic sports, they obviously depends on the school, but the resources vary. So to be able to add a full-time assistant coach is huge for every Olympic sport across every school, in the NCAA. So that's a positive change. And then another announcement that came through today was wrestling. Wrestling added so director of operations last year. Steve Middich was promoted to assistant coach. So Scott Goodell made that move. And again, being able to, and that wasn't a volunteer position, obviously, but they still have a volunteer assistant. But this is a add in terms of an assistant coach. And then they're going to be replacing the director of ops role. So I'm sure that, and you can actually publicly see that there's some coaching positions right now posted for Rutgers. Rowing has a spot posted. Baseball has a spot posted online. So I'm sure a lot of programs are going to take advantage of this opportunity to add an assistant coach. Again, budget is part of it in terms of needing to increase your budget to be able to hire these positions, but really positive changes. It's not every day we get to say that the NCAA made a good decision, but I would say that across the board, adding assistant coaching positions for basketball, and then adding changing the volunteer coach to an assistant coach for Olympic sports is an absolute huge change. So really good news there. Great to see Rutgers, and in terms of the programs that did make these changes and additions, really good stuff there. And like I said, they have a couple of programs that already have positions posted. And I would expect as many programs as possible. It might not happen right away. It might not happen this year, but you could see as many programs as possible eventually being able to add a coaching position. It helps, player development. It helps player support. It helps, the head coaches. It helps everything just in terms of um, all these different programs that lack resources just in terms of comparatively to a lot of the bigger sports. It's great to see that they now have an extra coaching position. So I hope I made that clear enough, or I did a decent job at explaining it, clarifying it. I'll have more details in the article for this podcast. But I feel like it hasn't really been talked about, and I thought it was important to address. So especially with so many Rutgers programs making coaching announcements in the last week or two. Thanks so much for listening to this edition of the Scarlet Faithful podcast, and I will talk to you tomorrow.